Joining me now is David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. So thank you so much, David, for being here. How significant is the president's focus on food insecurity during this Africa summit? And where should this rank as a priority when you think about, of course, all of the things that the president is talking about and dealing with?
Well, hi, Yamiche. Thank you very much for giving some attention to this very important issue. I think the president has really raised the game of the administration through this summit in very substantive ways. We've released a report this week that shows that over 20 million people in East Africa alone are suffering from food insecurity. And the predictions are that 750,000 or so in Somalia, just one country, will be in famine status by next year. So this is a very timely initiative. I think a couple of things are very significant. Firstly, there's real money behind this. 80% of international aid to Somalia is now coming from the US, so there's real leadership. What we haven't yet got is followers, so other countries need to follow in this wake. Secondly, I think it's very significant that the president has recognized the link between what's happening in Ukraine, which is at the top of the geopolitical agenda at the moment, and the African situation. African countries are paying the price of the Ukraine invasion because of what's happened to food prices and energy prices around the world. So there's geopolitics involved here. Thirdly, China has been a very significant actor in Africa over the last decade, and America has too often been, and the West more generally, has too often been absent. And I think that this is a very important signal that there's a structured relationship being built here. What we would say as a humanitarian organization is that alongside the politics and the trade, it's absolutely vital that those tens of millions of Africans who are being left behind by global prosperity, or worse, are in the absolute eye of the storm when it comes to the climate crisis and the conflicts that still besmirch too much of Africa, that they're not forgotten in this discussion.
And you talked about sort of the impact that this could have. So I wonder how important it is that African leaders, you have presidents and a number of officials, that they're actually in Washington to have this conversation.
Well, it's only important if there's some plain talking. And I'm impressed that there has been some straight talking and some plain talking. Part of the story of Africa is that there's Africa rising, and it's right to emphasize that. It's a burgeoning middle class, over 400 million people, 350 million people in the middle class. But it's vital that we don't ignore the three drivers of crisis that we highlight in the IRC's report this week. One, there's a lot of conflict in Africa, in Ethiopia, in Somalia, in Mali. In countries that are represented there, conflict is a feature. Secondly, the climate crisis is here now in Africa. And thirdly, the global risks that are around, like the pandemic, as well as the economic uncertainty that's been created out of the Ukraine crisis, those mustn't be ignored because, frankly, there are still 200-300 million Africans who are, if they're pushed to the edge, they're going to fall over. And it's very, very important that they're not left behind. This is a continent that will have the largest population growth between now and 2050. It's vital for the future of the continent, but also, frankly, the wider world, that we sustain the important growth rates that have been achieved in the best performers and tackle the really significant problems in the watch list countries that we've highlighted this week.
And you talked about some of the challenges that are being faced. What is the current impact of the war in Ukraine on African food insecurity? According to the IRC, 90% of grain supply of Somalia comes from Ukraine and Russia. That grain deal is, of course, still very shaky. How does that potential for a potential famine hinge on that agreement?
Well, I think that the famine consequences are really hinging on the global response because we know how to tackle starvation. It's a matter of resources and organization. But for the next level down, for those who are not yet at what's called level 5, but those who are at level 3 and 4, which means they don't know where their next meal is coming from, even though they're not in the starvation status, the consequences of the war in Ukraine are twofold. One is the grain deal that you very rightly highlight. 90% of Somali grain, of wheat actually, comes from Ukraine. There's obviously the fertilizer issue out of Russia. There's a false narrative being put out that there are sanctions, Western sanctions, that are somehow creating this food crisis. That's wrong. There are no sanctions on agriculture. But there's a second part of this. The Ukraine war has driven up energy prices. Energy prices drives up fuel prices. Transportation costs are an important part of the food basket. And that's part of the reason that you've seen a 40% rise in food prices in the 20 countries of the IRC watch list, double the level of food price inflation in countries like the US or Western Europe. So there's a very profound impact of the Ukraine crisis. It's not just a European problem, it's a global problem.
In 10 seconds here, do you trust Turkey to continue to broker those deals?
Yes, Turkey has a very strong interest in playing a good brokering role on this, so I'm hopeful. The problem isn't Turkey.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, David Miliband, for joining us.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.